Well, hello and welcome back to this week's episode of the Cincy Reformed Podcast. I'm Zac. I'm here with Brandon like normal, and we are co-pastors at Westside Reformed Church. Thank you for joining us. This week we're going to be talking about the basic topic of borrowing. And this might sound kind of strange, but borrowing when it comes to the biblical text and some of the biblical ideas that are found within the biblical text. And Brandon, would you mind maybe kind of shedding some light in terms of how some documentaries have maybe presented this concept? That way our listener knows a little bit more about what we're referring to when we talk here about borrowing.
Yeah, so there's been a few documentaries out. One came out maybe a decade or so ago, basically claiming that Christianity comes from the Egyptian god Horus, and that Horus was born of a virgin, lived a sinless life, died on a cross, rose again from the dead. And then we just kind of took this idea from the god Horus in Egypt, and then we said, well, that's Jesus. And I just kind of brought this quote-unquote myth over. And the whole documentary is kind of claiming that we just borrowed from Egypt, basically. And there's a newer documentary out that's claiming that we are borrowing from tales that were told about a Roman emperor. And we basically just kind of took what was said about Roman emperor and we're bringing that on board, and now we're speaking about Christ like that. Of course, that's not the case. And there's, the debates like this get messy because, for example, while the god Horus, right? I mean, that's an ancient deity that the ancient Egypts believed in for a long time, that even predates Christ. It's interesting that a lot of our writings actually on Horus postdate Christ. So even while the concept of the god Horus predates, our writings speaking about Horus postdate. And what's interesting is that there was, as Christianity was becoming more of a global thing, more of a sanctioned religion that was expanding, a lot of people were rewriting old myths with the narrative of the day. And so some of that could be going on. But also, too, when you go back and look at the ancient Egyptians and some of their gods and some of the stories of their gods, there's quite a bit of stretching happening, where people will talk about, well, this one god became a seed, and then the seed died, and then it sprouted into something else, and so see, that's the resurrection. It's like, well, I think you're stretching here. You're trying to find these like odd parallels that may or may not really be there. So one, there's a lot of stretching when they're trying to make parallels with Christianity to an ancient deity. And secondly, the writings on those ancient deities come after the birth of Christ, when the narrative of Christ was being kind of propagated around a bit. So again, it's a hairy debate. It gets into documentation and manuscripts and the dating of manuscripts, how we know about various deities and such. And so it's a kind of a tedious debate to enter into. Those are some of the claims though that's out there.
So does that mean that the Old Testament, the Jews, and that Christians never borrowed anything? And does that make borrowing, like if we did borrow something, would that undermine Christianity and our biblical faith? What are some of your thoughts on that, as to, did it happen, and if it did, is that a problem?
Sure. So I do think that pagan nations borrowed from the true religion, the true God, the true people of God. I think even from, thinking about the false religions out there. One person calls them copycat religions, where Satan is making a lot of copycats based upon the true one. And so you see a lot of other religions that have some similarities, right? But I think that is, again, Satan inspiring these copycat religions. And all the way through creation, back to the very beginning of creation, there was a promise that the seed of the woman would come and crush the seed of the serpent, or the head of the serpent. And so even all the way back to Adam in the garden, the very beginning of creation, the gospel is being told, right? And so it makes sense, even if we find parallels between an ancient god or ancient religion or whatever it is, even if we see parallels, it's because this true narrative of the gospel of Jesus Christ goes back all the way to the beginning of creation with Adam and Eve, and it's been carried on throughout history, where progressive revelation, we're getting more and more info. For example, with Isaiah telling us that the seed of the woman was going to actually be a virgin, and so on and so forth. So these ideas did not sprout up with Jesus 2,000 years ago. These ideas about the gospel have been promised since right after the beginning of creation. So we should not see problems when we see parallels. In fact, one book entitled Against the Gods by John Currid, he spoke about how there's places where we see Egypt borrowing from Israel. So, for example, we know that in Exodus, for example, God says, I am who I am. He calls himself the great I am. Well, there's a text where Egypt actually kind of borrowed that phrase and placed it on one of their gods, where one of their gods said, he is the I am. And scholars see with the evidence that actually it was Egypt borrowing from ancient Israel. It's interesting that in kind of the secular mind, though, whenever a secular person sees a parallel or a borrowing, they automatically say, well, Israel must have got it from the pagans. Well, Christians must have got it from the pagans. And they never say it the other way around. Because borrowing happened from taking what is true of the true God and the true religion, and then borrowing that as well. But you're right, Zach, there has been some borrowing of the pagans as well. So there have been wisdom writings in ancient Egypt, for example, that ancient Israel took on as well. So the borrowing wasn't just one way or the other, but there was kind of a back and forth borrowing, right? So for example, in one of the borrowings, Amenhotep, one of the Egyptians writing a wisdom book, he said, "Do not associate to thyself the heated man, nor visit him for conversation." So a wisdom writing, warning about not visiting somebody who's heated or angry. But there's a notable parallel with Proverbs 22:24. "Make no friendship with a man given to anger, nor go with a wrathful man." So kind of a parallel here between what was written in Egypt, what was written in the Bible. So how do we understand some of these parallels, I guess, would be another question, right?
I think so, because when we start to, we could get carried away, couldn't we? Mm-hmm. If we begin to think that, this borrowing means that, Israel or the church adopted everything that the pagan world was thinking. We don't want to go there, obviously, do we? But then we also see things like, my mind goes to John chapter 1, and then the use of the term logos to speak about Jesus, which is sort of taking a concept that was common amongst the Greco-Roman world and then applying that to Christ. But it didn't mean that there's like a wholesale adoption of the worldview that stood behind that, did it?
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and even one more example, when Paul says, in him we live and move and have our being, that was from a pagan poet that was speaking about Zeus. But obviously repackaging that and showing how that only really worked on a Christian scheme of things. So we understand that the worldview of the Egyptians and the worldview of the Israelites were antithetical to one another. So for example, on several points, you can see they're not lining up here. Whereas Israel believed in one God, the true God. In ancient Egypt, it was polytheistic. You had many gods. they had this idea that there was a cosmic order of justice and truth that they called Ma'at. But what's interesting is, even though Ma'at is spoken of as a goddess, it functioned like a concept, something impersonal, like an impersonal concept out there, almost akin to a fate or something, right? They also saw education and imparting wisdom in more disciplinary ways. Now, discipline, correction, and teaching can have a close meaning within the Bible, but with Egypt, it had more of a discipline connotation, whereas in the Bible, it had more of a pedagogical connotation. And then also, the audience was different as well. For Solomon's writing wisdom for his son. In fact, it was used by the ancient Israelites as a textbook to teach children in school. Like, they would use the book of Proverbs to instruct wisdom in school. But in Egypt, it's interesting. The aim in Egypt was aimed at senior and middle ranking officials. It had almost a governmental function here. So the contexts are different, where the Proverbs speak about God creating the universe, not coming out of like a chaotic thing, not coming out of battling gods or deities, but it was God creating, and wisdom. He created the world through wisdom, and the whole worldview of the Proverbs is just different from the worldview of Egypt. But even though the Egyptians were fallen, sinful people, they still had common grace insights. They still were able, because of God's common grace, to produce and see various works of wisdom. Now, that had to be reappropriated. You don't want to bring something wholesale, as you mentioned, because the wisdom of the Egyptians was in a very polytheistic way. It had some different connotations to it, and so you can't just bring it in with all these Trojan horses that are going to kind of wreck your understanding of the true God. But it has to be scrubbed of its paganism. But still, there was truth to be gleaned by some of what we see from the Egyptians, I think. I think Palmer Robertson, he wrote a book called The Christ of Wisdom, and he was wrestling with this kind of back and forth, and how do we understand the borrowing of Egyptian wisdom writings and bringing that into Scripture, or repackaging it? How do we understand that? And he had a great statement. He said, their interrelationship may be best explained through presuming studied interaction among the schooling experiences of the wisdom scribes of the various nations, which undoubtedly provided opportunity for the study of a wide range of wisdom writings. It is quite possible to imagine, he says, Solomon and the wise men of his kingdom scrutinizing the wisdom material of Egypt, noting the sameness of some of their proverbial sayings, and adjusting them so that they would conform to the larger truth arising from the uniqueness of Yahweh, and the one and only true God of creation and covenant, who revealed himself with consistency to Abraham, the patriarchs, Moses, and the people of Israel. And then he goes on to say, if in any way Israel derived some of its expressions from the wisdom of Egypt, they must be understood as being wholly transformed by their context in the Old Testament faith of Israel. So because God's common grace, we see insights with many, many nations, other people, pagans, and we can glean those, and we can incorporate those. And we see Israel doing that. But to your point before, we don't want to go to an extreme with it and say, well, they just borrowed everything. Well, they didn't just borrow everything. Again, I think they scrutinized, as Robertson said. They scrutinized, seeing the sameness of some things and scrubbing it of its paganness, you could say, bringing it into a proper understanding of the world and God, etc. So, anything else to add?
I don't think so. I think that's been very helpful. Thanks for walking us through that, and we hope that's been helpful for you. May we be encouraged to have and seek common grace insights as we go into the world around us, always applying that, however, to the biblical worldview and the biblical way of thinking, But nevertheless, recognizing that people around us who are not believers have real insights that we can benefit from, because again, God does shed abroad his common grace to all, even though the church alone celebrates his saving grace. So we hope it's been helpful for you. Please join us next week at Cincy Reformed Podcast. Until then, Zac, Brandon here. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.